Hello and welcome to the 27th conference of the ISDRS, the International Sustainable Development Research Society. My name is Katrin Johansson. I'm professor in organizational communication and sustainability coordinator at Mid Sweden University. And together with my colleague, Professor Volker Mauerhofer, from the Department of Eco-Technology and Sustainable Building Engineering, we are going to host you during this conference and guide you through the program. In a world warmer than ever, suffering from the global pandemic health crisis of COVID-19, our work as researchers and educators is more important than ever before. I'm very proud that our small university in the north has stepped up to take on this challenge to arrange this conference and said, yes, we can arrange an online digital event. And we started planning in November. And I'm really proud that our staff have been dedicated and worked so hard to realize it. But above all, I'm very proud that we accommodate 500 participants in this conference, and we will be able to take part of more than 400 presentations, 97 full papers, and 35 posters. And we have a lot of delegates from all over the world, from Brazil to Canada, to Norway, Portugal, Turkey, Asia, China, Malaysia, Japan, Australia. I hope that you will all benefit from this conference today. We started already yesterday with a PhD conference with 50 PhD students, and today we have a very interesting program with distinguished keynotes and parallel sessions ahead of us. And also don't forget the poster session where you can interact with the 12 first posters already during the lunch break today. Now, over to Volker. You have been working 24/7 the past weeks, right?
Not really. I got some sleep, but it's fine. So you're also welcome from my side. My name is Volker Mauerhofer. I'm a professor and chair for environmental science with specialization in social science. And I'm also the vice president of the International Society for Sustainable Development Research. When it happened in last autumn that our planned host for this conference dropped out, I went to the dean and asked him what shall we do, and I proposed to him to organize it ourselves, and our team was very excited and supportive to this idea, and we started really to plan in November from the scratch. We even changed the conference system at that time, which we usually used for this conference, and we made it running. And yeah, I was actually on holiday in November, but at one time my head of department asked me, where are you? Because that's not any more holidays, so I have to know where you are, yeah. And yeah, so I started in November, and we have a great team. We have people from the communication office, particularly Richard, Matilda. We have an intern, Eleanor, which is doing great work. We have, of course, our conference manager, which is Inger, which is also working all day night. And so it's not only two people which you see sitting here, but it's all of us. It's a team, and we had monthly meetings, we had weekly meetings, and last weeks we increased it to twice per week. And I don't want to miss those meetings because they were really great fun. So yes, welcome. Katrin already introduced what you're going to see the next days. Are just regarding yesterday, we also want to thank really our great peers. Yesterday in the PhD workshop, there were about 30 people helping young, promising researchers, early stage researchers to get their PhD work in a better role, in a better rope, in a better shape. So really thank you also to those people who acted as peers. Thank you to the people in the new professional group, Sarah. Thank you to the team in Portugal, are Sandra and Thomas, who worked also very hard for this PhD workshop to make it happen. And I think it went out quite well. It worked out quite well. So this is really a good start into this whole event. What are you going to expect for the next days? Katrin mentioned already the number of sessions and the number of our posters which we have, starting with this lunchtime with the posters and starting with the sessions before lunchtime. We have also several meetings planned. There is a membership meeting, for example, and that's done twice actually, once in the evening on today, Tuesday, and once on Thursday morning, so that we cover all our time zones with our different members. But you can also squeeze in if you are not member, that's great. We want to have new people watch our member meeting and think about. Second, we have also a mentorship mingle that's planned for Wednesday evening, where also early career researchers meet first, and that's more a closed meeting for half an hour, but then also everybody can come in and look what this is about, how he or she can benefit from this. So there's plenty of opportunities, plenty of options out there which you could visit the next 3 days. And you can see our online program. It's interactive. You can download abstracts. You can download full papers. So please take advantage of this new system, take advantage of these opportunities, and have a great conference. So having said this, I would like to introduce also a first talk of our Vice Chancellor, which is Anders Fjellström, and who want to also send a few words of greetings to all of you. So please have a look on Anders' talk.
I would like to welcome you all to this conference and to Mid-Sweden University. It's of course a pity that you are not able to visit us in Sundsvall or Östersund this year, but hopefully you will have the opportunity to come here later on in the future. Östersund, a city in the mountains in the western part of Sweden, and Sundsvall by the sea in the eastern part of our country. We are a global university with regional engagement. We want to bring the world to our region, to take part in solving the big global challenges, to be important in the development of our region and country, and take our science, thoughts and ideas out to the world. I would like to welcome you all to this conference and to Mid-Sweden University. It's of course a pity that you are not able to visit us in Sundsvall or Östersund this year, but hopefully you will have the opportunity to come here later on in the future. Östersund, a city in the mountains in the western part of Sweden, and Sundsvall by the sea in the eastern part of our country. We are a global university with regional engagement. We want to bring the world to our region, to take part in solving the big global challenges, to be important in the development of our region and country, and take our science, thoughts and ideas out to the world. Saying this, you understand that sustainability is a main focus for us, important in more or less all what we do. And together with internationalization, I would say that this is one of the most focused and important areas for our university. International relations are of course important for all universities. Bringing in new thoughts, ideas and cultures are often the best way to get research and education of the highest quality done. Located in a remote place in the world, as we are, this is, however, even more important for us. International conferences is one way of doing this, and this is why I am so glad to see you all participate today, although not physically here. As I said, sustainability includes, or at least should cover, all activities at the university, but from my point of view, our most important task and where we can make the biggest difference is in our research and education. And that Mid-Sweden University get the opportunity to arrange a conference like this is therefore something that makes me very proud and happy. combining sustainability and internationalization. With these words, I will just finish and once again welcome you all to the conference, wishing you the most interesting days and discussions, and from the bottom of my heart, cordially wish you welcome to Östersund and Sundsvall. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. We had some problems with the sound there. I hope that you all could hear Anders' welcoming words. And he is our Vice Chancellor that also decided to take into sustainability goals in our vision for the whole university. And we're going to increase our work with sustainable development. So that's implemented from the top also. Apart from all researchers and staff that's working with these questions. Now, Volker, over to the next issue.
Yes. Thank you very much, Katrin, and thank you, Anders, for your kind words. I will just give you now an overview about what you experience next days in terms of overall topics, in terms of special sessions. So we have 3 days of conference, and we have the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. So we will start with the environmental dimensions, and the keynote speakers and plenary speakers of the first day will focus on that issue. So the second day, then we will have the social dimension of sustainability as the main focus of our keynote speaker and of our plenary speakers. And the third day, the morning session with the keynote speaker and the afternoon session with the plenary speakers will address the economic dimensions of sustainability. And we have then, on all 3 days, the 10 conference themes quite mixed up, and we will try at each day to provide to each of you some interesting sessions from all those themes. So you can see in the conference program, in the colorful online program, you can see these colorful columns which go down from the first day to the last day. And there you can see that each colorful column spreads throughout all the 3 days. So we hope that you can all find something really interesting for you in all the 3 days. Having said this, I come now to the first keynote speaker, which we had to put about 15 minutes ahead in the program. So he will start now just at 10:15. And it's like carrying owls to Athens to introduce Jeffrey D. Sachs in this auditorium, because he's one of the really world-known figures in terms of sustainable development and SDGs. He's the chairperson of the Sustainable Solution Networks. He was 20 years, I think, in Harvard, a professor. Then he changed to Columbia, to the Earth, and built up the Earth's Institute at Columbia University. He was the information person for several presidents of the United States. I could continue like this perhaps for 15 minutes, but I do not want to let Jeffrey wait too long. I think he's already online, what I heard. Hi, Jeff.
Yeah.
We met the first time in 2010 at the ISDRS conference in Columbia at the university, where you also gave a fantastic keynote speech, and I'm so happy that you're with us. And I think the auditorium is as happy as me to have you with us. And thank you for being available. Thank you for being in Europe at this time. Otherwise, it would be very troublesome to have you at this time of the day. And it was really good to hear that you can do exactly the time which we hoped for. We put you 15 minutes ahead in order to keep flexible with your time. So it's so great to see you again and to have you here. I think you introduce further yourself. You introduce the title of your talk.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So.
Well, thank you
go.
very much.
Yeah.
So happy to be part of this great initiative. I was, of course, delighted to hear the Vice Chancellor's remarks just now on the great commitment of Mid-Sweden University to sustainable development, making it a core theme of the university, both in the research and the teaching. I wholeheartedly subscribe to this. It's a fantastic, vital, complex area, thrilling for research, necessary for society, and filled with unsolved problems, both conceptual and practical. And I'm going to talk about the practicalities of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially one dimension of the SDGs, and that is finance. Because we live in a world that is not only divided between rich and poor, but where the tendencies are for wider and wider divisions. And certainly during the COVID pandemic, though countries rich and poor have suffered from the pandemic, we see the economic impacts and the social impacts pulling the world apart even farther, and leaving the SDGs in an even more difficult and troubled situation. Remember that the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by all of the UN member states, the 193 countries that are members of the UN, in September 2015, with a set of targets for the year 2030. And then a few weeks after the SDGs were adopted, the Paris Agreement was concluded in December 2015. And that is an absolute linked set of objectives. So we should view the SDGs and the Paris Agreement really as one broad commitment to global sustainable development, and with a timeline. Now, even before COVID-19, we were not achieving the timeline, and it is both my commitment personally in my own way of thinking that we should take seriously the goals that we set and aim to achieve them, and also the conceptual problem that I spend most of my time thinking about is how does one have a complex, divided world work together on a set of objectives, taking them seriously and finding the institutional, financial, and other means to actually achieve what we have claimed we want to achieve. The reason I take that very seriously is that I think we had better achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we want a decent world. In other words, I don't think that these are just nice to have goals. I think they are central to global safety, to global security, to peace, and ultimately to human well-being. So we really want to achieve them, and yet we don't. Then came COVID, and we are still reeling from a pandemic where our governments have not done at all a good job. With very few exceptions, I think our governments have really failed in basic public health tasks, and globally have failed in the overarching task of cooperation. We don't have a cooperative fight against COVID. We have, again, countries on their own, doing their own thing, guessing what to do. It's quite haphazard. It's not effective. And we know painfully every day that it's illogical when viruses cross national boundaries, when they can emerge with new variants anywhere in the world, to think that we could be separate islands taking care of ourselves rather than approaching the question of global control. Well, the SDGs and climate change share that structure. We will not succeed in any of the big goals that we've set unless we succeed together. That's not a moralistic point. That's a practical point. We can't make climate change work just in the middle of Sweden or over Manhattan, where I live, or any other place, unless we have a world that is cooperating on a safe energy system and sustainable land use. So I want to spend a few minutes from a research point of view and a conceptual point of view to ask what is happening in this complex world that we don't cooperate properly and perhaps don't frame the issue properly. And I'm going to try to share my screen if I can do that. I think I can. I think that you can see the screen. You're, of course, looking at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They do embrace the 3 pillars of sustainable development: basic economics, overcoming deprivation, ending poverty, ending hunger, assuring universal health coverage, assuring universal access to education, and so on. The social dimensions, especially SDGs 5, 10, and 16, gender equality, reduced income and wealth inequality, SDG 10, and equal access to justice, SDG 16, and the environmental pillar of sustainable development, especially around SDG 7, which is sustainable energy for all. SDG 6, I should have mentioned, it's covered in my screen, access to safe water and sanitation. And then SDGs 11 through 15, sustainable cities, circular consumption, circular production and consumption, cleaning up after our pollution and our wastes, SDG 13 on climate action, SDG 14 on sustainable marine ecosystems, and SDG 15 on sustainable terrestrial ecosystems. And then a goal that I really like, I only wish we took it seriously, SDG 17, global partnerships for sustainable development. This is an agenda. This is a set of objectives that is not merely a wish list or a dream or a utopia. It is actually, because each of these 17 goals has around 10 specific targets, almost all of which are timed to the year 2030, and almost none of which is being achieved on the timeline that is needed by much of the world. Let me say that the network of universities that I am honored to help lead under the auspices of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, issues a report each year on the state of the SDGs. We rank the countries as measuring their proximity to achieving the SDGs. Sweden, not surprisingly, is one of the best performers in the world. All of the Nordic countries are at the top of the world's list. Finland, Sweden, Iceland, Norway, Denmark are all in the top 10. Actually, the top of the list, almost all of the top 20 countries are European countries. This is a good sign for Europe as Europe adopts the European Green Deal. But let me say that no country yet achieves all of the SDGs, even the best performers. But what we find, of course, is that for most of the world, the gaps between SDG ambition and reality are huge. And what we showed, not surprisingly, in this year's report, which you can find online and download for free, is that 2020 was a year of significant regress. For the first time, there was not progress, there was a reversal. In the previous years, there was progress that was too slow. 2020 was, of course, a year in which we fell farther away from the SDGs because of rising poverty, rising hunger, rising displacement, loss of jobs, and of course, many other ills that came together with the pandemic. Now, I want us to think about what's missing here, aside from getting the pandemic under control, which is, of course, a prerequisite to achieve anything. And the point that I want to emphasize is that the economic and social divide in the world is widening. There is a partial exception to that, and China's development is one of the great equalizing forces in the world. It's a shame that the United States is so hostile to China, because China's development success is a great success in ending poverty and in improving the quality of lives for hundreds of millions of people. And it's something that should be praised, not attacked or feared, in my view. But more generally, the divide between the rich and the poor is not narrowing. And most of the developing world is falling behind and is disastrously behind in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's a little like this picture of vaccine coverage, which of course everybody knows well. This is just clipped from the screen today. This shows the number of vaccine doses per 100 population across the world. And we know that there are a group of wealthy countries, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, European Union, China, in this case, with its vaccines, and a couple of other countries that got in there early and purchased vaccines privately from companies, Israel, Chile, Uruguay. But most of the developing world doesn't have the R&D, doesn't produce the vaccines, and has been at the back of the line. And I would say that the world generally works like this. Africa is at the back of the line for everything. Much of Asia is in the back of the line. Here we see that South America is somewhere in the middle, but in fact, South America is quite destabilized right now with the complete immunization coverage, maybe 5 to 10% of the population only, and the pandemic running quite wild. Well, this kind of picture of a world that is so divided, in this case, in immunization coverage, is a general picture of the world. And I find this particular map quite important and quite interesting. This is today's 10-year bond rate for sovereign bonds. When governments borrow, what interest rate do they pay? And to me, this is not only, again, an illustration of a divided world, but is one of the main puzzles and reasons for the deeply divided world. What you see here is, again, the same advanced countries are the ones shaded in green in Europe or in yellow, including the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And what you're seeing here is that the countries in green, which are include Sweden and basically the Eurozone countries, are borrowing at near zero interest rates. So in order to finance investment, governments can borrow significantly and pay almost nothing for that borrowing in terms of interest costs. In the United States, Canada, Australia, the borrowing costs are between 1% and 2% per annum interest. But then look at the rest of the world, all in red, or some countries don't borrow at all. Those are the ones in gray. But the developing countries pay between 5 and 15% annual interest costs on sovereign loans. So the rich countries can borrow at almost no cost. The poor countries pay a very, very steep premium if they can borrow at all. Not surprisingly, capital is not only scarce in the developing countries, it is not, the problem is not getting solved, because when poor countries need to make investments to achieve the sustainable development goals in water and sanitation and renewable energy and digital connectivity, they can't afford it. And that's the basic story, that the division of rich and poor is manifested also in the conditions of the financial markets. And so rather than capital flowing to the poor countries, capital mainly flows to the rich countries, often to finance consumption, a lot of frivolous consumption, I might add. I'm not a huge fan of Richard Branson's 15 minutes in outer space or in space tourism as a high priority for the world these days. It just seems to me that it is wealth run amok rather than something serious for the world. But given the way the financial system works, the money doesn't flow to safe water and sanitation in Peru or in Africa. It flows to Virgin Galactica for 15-minute space flights for rich millionaire and billionaire tourists. And that is a significant wrong for the world. Now, one of the implications of this is that in the pandemic, governments in the rich world were able to take care of themselves, but in the poor world were not. This is a graph from the International Monetary Fund. There are three groups of countries in this graph. The LIDCs are the low-income developing countries. The EMs are the emerging markets or middle-income countries, and the AEs are the advanced economies. And what you're seeing here is the fiscal support, the stimulus packages that were funded in the three groups of countries. So who had the biggest fiscal packages as a share of the economy? The rich countries. They could borrow at zero interest, so they could finance income support, social protection, support for industry, and so forth. Whereas the low-income countries can't pay for anything. They can't borrow. They pay punitive interest costs. So they just suffered. And their income decline during the pandemic has been all the greater as a result of that. So this is a picture of the world that is unfair and getting less fair, because the rich countries could take care of themselves, the poor countries not. Achieving the SDGs, I would argue, is mainly a task of public investment. And of course, there's a lot of research and analytics. What kind of investment? How should it be structured? What are the appropriate timelines and milestones? But I believe that we should think about the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement as basically an investment program, and overwhelmingly a public investment program. And I identify 6 areas of public investment that are needed as the highest priorities. The first being education, by far the most important investment that any society makes. And yet hundreds of millions of kids in poor countries are not even in school today. The schools were closed and the online coverage didn't exist to be able to move online. These countries also lack R&D capacity, which is why they're in the back of the line for a vaccine. The second big investment is public health systems and healthcare coverage. We assume that healthcare coverage is a universal good. Sweden certainly has implemented that for decades, but most of the world does not ensure healthcare coverage, which is SDG 3.8. And we have learned that our public health systems are deficient and were not up to the task of containing the pandemic. And I'm afraid that's true of Sweden as well. And that really needs a serious review. Third is universal access to sustainable energy services. We have between 1 and 2 billion people in the world that do not have reliable access to electricity. Try achieving sustainable development without electricity. Impossible. We need not only electricity, of course, we need it to be green electrons, wind and solar, hydro, and other zero carbon energy sources. And so we need to close the gap of electrification and ensure that we're doing that in a sustainable manner. The fourth area is to grow the right kinds of food in an environmentally sustainable manner, rather than clearing rainforests or through massive overuse of chemical fertilizers and other inputs. We need a precision agriculture. This is agronomically known, but it's expensive. It requires capital investments, even for irrigation or fertigation, putting fertilizer into drip irrigation and so forth. This is a lot of capital per hectare, but it is the way that we can grow more food on a smaller area of land and thereby save ecosystems, as well as ensure nutritious diets for all. We need to invest heavily in urban infrastructure, water, sanitation, transport services, digital, and much of the, well, all of the urbanization taking place in the next 20 years, 1.5 to 2 billion people by mid-century, I would say, will be in developing countries, in massive urban settlements in developing countries. And the infrastructure for those places doesn't exist now. Either these will be absolutely dangerous and unhealthful and unproductive places to live, or the financing will be achieved. And then finally, I would say in a digital age, we need universal digital access to ensure even basic human rights now for each person. But in order to make all of the rest of the governance systems and service systems work, we need digital inclusion, and that's another form of investment. What is my point here? My point is that these are big ticket investment items, and yet I've shown you the poor countries cannot finance these investments right now. This is the structural challenge that the world faces. If you use IMF data to ask about the share of investment in gross domestic product, what you find is that other than in developing countries of Asia, there is insufficient investment in the developing countries. Basically, Sub-Saharan Africa, developing Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean have about 20% of GDP in investment per year. That's public and private. But since the capital stock is so weak in those countries, they should be investing at least 30 to 40% of GDP, but are not doing so because they don't have the means to finance that higher investment. A recent IMF staff paper, which I would recommend, very nicely done, published in April 2021, makes what they call a post-pandemic assessment of the SDGs. I hope it's post-pandemic. But what the IMF team shows is that in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in a few key areas, health, education, water, sanitation, transport, and power, a country like Rwanda needs to spend 20% of GDP more than it's doing per year. Nigeria, another 18 or so percent. Pakistan, another 8.8%. Cambodia, another 8.1%. In other words, this is a financing gap that can be demonstrated as the insufficiency of current investments if the SDGs are to be achieved. So we have a financing problem. Then the IMF asks, well, if there is tax reform and structural reform and some private investment, could this gap be eliminated? And the answer is no. Even under optimistic, maybe even overly optimistic assumptions by the IMF, a current gap of 14% of GDP could perhaps be reduced to 8% of GDP financing gap. That's optimistic, but still there would be a massive financing gap to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So my conclusion is that we need a major reform of the international financial system because it is delivering low-cost finance to rich countries, but not to poor countries. The poor countries lack the tax base, they lack the public revenues, and they lack the borrowing power in order to be able to achieve these basic objectives. I think we need roughly $1 trillion a year, or 1% of world output per year, as increased financing for governments, and mainly from official sources. What kinds of revenues could we mobilize in a solidaristic world? What could we do? Well, first, we should tax the billionaires. If they have enough money to take 15-minute rides in space, they certainly have enough money to pay some taxes. There are 2,755 billionaires in the world. Their combined net worth today is on the order of $13 trillion. If they paid just 2% of their wealth each year as a wealth tax, that would be $260 billion. So I put on my checklist 200 billion paid annually by the world's billionaires. Of course, we're at zero right now. We're not even trying to collect a wealth tax from the world's richest people. Mr. Bezos reached $200 billion of personal wealth paying no taxes in the United States, because our tax system doesn't tax rich people on their capital gains as they are enjoying soaring wealth. We could also have a global financial transactions tax, collecting perhaps 50 billion per year. We should be taxing the global digital industry, especially the digital giants. And that would raise a lot of funding. The US government has been blocking that to protect its digital giants. This is, in my view, a wrong policy. We should be charging against carbon taxation the emitting countries to provide relief to countries experiencing climate disasters. So the poor countries are experiencing massive losses and damages from climate. The rich countries that are historically responsible for those emissions do not pay anything for the damages being incurred by the developing countries. I think that carbon taxation could raise funding to help the Caribbean countries face hurricane risk, to help the small island states face rising sea levels, and to help countries take the adaptation that they are desperately in need of as climate change continues. And then the fifth point on my agenda is to recapitalize the MDBs, the multilateral development banks. The multilateral development banks are the World Bank and the regional development banks, like the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and so forth. These banks should be major conduits for perhaps $500 billion a year of investments in green energy, for example. And because they can leverage their balance sheets, $1 of paid-in capital to the World Bank or to the African Development Bank can be leveraged 5-to-1 as those banks go out to borrow at a AAA rating in the capital markets and then on lend at very low interest rates to their member states. So I think that for $100 billion a year paid in by the rich world, which is 0.2% of GDP, and the United States, the country with the biggest, large country with the biggest insufficiency of development financing, we could leverage that to something on the order of $500 billion per year of incremental funding. Well, this list of 5 ideas totals $1 trillion a year, or about 1% of gross world product. If we were channeling this funding, there would be electrification, there would be children in school, there would be clinics, safe drinking water and sewerage systems, there would be digital connectivity. And on that basis, private investment could also flow into developing countries because there would be an infrastructure base and a human capital base for earning private returns in the productive sector of the economy. So I'll just conclude at this point to say that the numbers that I've illustrated are large in absolute amounts. $1 trillion a year is not a pittance, but the world economy is $100 trillion a year. And so if we shift a small proportion of the world economy through taxation or the balance sheets of regional development banks to help bring about high priority investments in developing countries, we could achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. My hope is that this trauma of the COVID-19 will be recognized for what it is, a sign of how insufficient our current multilateral system is, how completely interdependent we are for our health and our well-being, even our survival, our recognition that we are rich enough to solve our problems, and will lead in the next year upon reflection, I'm hoping, within the major economies to the notion that we really do need to do something different, because while the world is in turmoil, it won't be good enough to have a few dozen billionaire space tourists. We have to do better with our resources to solve the world's problems. Let me thank you very much for the chance to be with you and wish all of you the best in the conference, but also hoping that we will stay in contact on this research agenda, because we really are, as researchers, all in it together as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. I really appreciate so much that you highlight these complex challenges from the global perspective, the division between the rich and the poor, situation with Africa back of the line, but you also provide some hopeful solutions to these complex issues with this financing ways. We have achieved a number of questions in the chat for you while you were speaking. So I will just start with the first question, and I will just ask you also if you might consider to share your slides afterwards. That would be great, but that's your option to do that. But we have a question here relating to the United States. And the question is, with the United States under new administration, do you see the SDGs being achieved within your country? My question is also thinking about the US having a federal system which states are stronger than the central government.
Well, we are, as I think you can see, a very divided society, a very deeply fractured political system. We have no consensus in the United States on big issues, and we are divided by race, by class, by geography. We have a decent president, a good man is what I mean, an honest and decent person. We had a psychopath as president for 4 years who still lurks in the shadows, an extremely dangerous man, Trump. And so I think the future of the United States is really very uncertain right now. It's just a very wounded country and not a particularly safe country, safe for itself or safe for the world. There are obviously tremendous strengths in some regions and some technological capacity, but we're also a very confused society. The SDGs play almost no role in American political discourse in Washington. I don't know whether the politicians even know of the SDGs. Of course, we just went through 4 years of Trump, who was, in my view, certainly the most evil president the United States has ever had. And he would never have even mentioned these goals. President Biden faces a Congress that is divided almost completely down the middle. And the Republican Party is a profoundly corrupt institution, financially corrupted, intellectually corrupted, and a very dangerous party, in my view. It is like a radical right party in Europe, but it's one of our two major parties in the United States. And so I am just holding my breath about the United States and trying to give any kind of support I can to the Biden administration. But I'm not counting on the United States to be the stable world leader of this. For that, we really need Europe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeff, also from my side for your really wise input and great insights and proposals. Just ahead, we have quite many questions already in the chat, and we might not be able to cover all of them in the time. And also some of the questions are already addressed by your financial proposals, I think already, but we will try to get as many questions in there. Just insight from my side. Sweden, you mentioned, is far up when it comes to the implementation of the SDGs, and perhaps we are far up because we can afford it, yeah? And on the other side, we are far up because we have a quite high ecological footprint, so we use resources quite much to become rich, and then we can afford to implement the SDGs. So there's also some sort of dilemma in there in this. And I want to go back to this to the questions, and there's one about Africa and the SDGs. As Africa is far behind in implementing the SDGs, what is your advice for the younger generation, particularly, to move forward? How could the younger generation in Africa go forward?
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me say one thing about the questions coming in the chat and the Q&A, and that is because time is very short. We don't have enough time for me to clarify concepts. Somebody said I mentioned precision agriculture. That's what Monsanto wants. That's not what I mean at all by precision agriculture. I mean not putting more chemical fertilizer on crops than you need. So when this questioner, Thomas Hahn, says researchers suggest agroecology, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, so why do I stick to precision agriculture? I just want to make clear this is maybe words and semantics, but I mean something quite different from Monsanto, not even close to that. By that, I mean, for example, drip irrigation, which I think is an extremely important and practical point in a water-stressed world, but it requires a rather significant investment of capital. And that is, to my mind, extremely important. Of course, one of the issues for us as researchers is to try to identify best pathways to achieve goals, taking into account local climatology, local pedology, local conditions, and that's why research is so vital on this. Another questioner was asking, why don't I talk about circular economy? Yes, for sure. Circular economy is a big part. I mentioned it in passing because I only had a half an hour to discuss things. And the questioner said, aren't I just saying more? Well, not quite, except I would say more of the following. We need more electricity, actually. We really do. Worldwide, a lot more, because 1 to 2 billion people use almost no electricity, but they're going to need it for sustainable transport. They're going to need it for connectivity. They're going to need it because they will have a connected device just like you do and I do, and they need that as well. They need a light bulb, or not, if not an incandescent bulb, they need lighting. They need refrigeration. They need perhaps pumps, heat pump, and so forth. We're going to need more of certain things, but we're going to need them in a sustainable manner. Fortunately, this is completely feasible, but this is what good quantification and good diagnosis should show. When it comes to Africa, let me say that the situation is where in rural areas where perhaps 50 to 60% of Africans live in most of sub-Saharan Africa, the infrastructure situation is not what you would even be able to imagine unless you have personal experience. Electrification does not exist. Access to safe water and sanitation is extremely sparse. Connectivity, certainly of broadband, is extremely limited. Access to devices for connectivity is limited. None of these is insoluble, not at all. This is actually, from the point of view of the world economy, small ticket, not big ticket. But from the point of view of poor people, a big hurdle, especially when the government would have to pay 10% interest rates on borrowing, which if it was able to get the borrowing. So my whole point is not that this is impossible, but that it requires a coherent, direct strategy. For young people in Africa, there's no question that skill development is paramount. Digital connectivity is paramount. Both of those are, I believe, utterly achievable. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now is to promote essentially free access to higher education through digital learning in a short period of time, because I think there could be a massive increase of skilling, of specific training, of access to education that in our countries, well, in my country, it would cost a lot, even out of pocket. In Sweden, it might not cost out of pocket, but it would still be fairly expensive. But in Africa, I think we could help with African academic leadership to promote free, very low cost, widespread education, also adult education and skills. But in general, the amount of financing that's needed to meet basic needs is significant as a share of the economies of these low-income countries. And that's what these IMF studies are showing. And the IMF has not traditionally been the one to demonstrate that, but it's done a series of excellent studies over the last 3 years, asking in a very practical way, what is really needed financially and organizationally and institutionally to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's the point of the slides I was showing. More financing, well targeted, can do the job. But the financial means need to be created because they do not currently prevail. They will not be provided by private capital markets. They are not at the disposal of governments, and these investments are not getting made at this moment.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for this wrapping up and to the force through most of the questions. I have to apologize if some of the details have not addressed very extensively, but we are at the end of our question and answer time, and Jeff had to go earlier because he has to speak in the high level panel, and so I appreciate very much the time which you gave to us, that you were also able to go 15 minutes earlier to keep the full 45 minutes with us. And thank you for your great insights. We have all the questions in the chat. Everybody could read them at least and catch up with others or with us. So thank you so much, Jeff, for your being
Wonderful.
with us.
Thanks to you, and all best wishes on a great conference.
Thank you so much, and you are happy to stay also in the conference for the 1 hour session. Thank you. So I will hand over to my colleague, Katrin.
Yes, so that was really inspiring, and we are moving on to the next point in the program, and we will have some welcoming words also from our Dean, Professor Hans-Erik Nilsson, who is Dean of the Faculty of Science, Technology and Media. And he was also one of the people at Mid-Sweden University that stepped in and made this conference possible, because he was accommodating the risk of organizing such an event. So please, over to you, Hans-Erik.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the Mid-Sweden University, even if this will be an online experience. As Katrin said, my name is Hans-Erik Nilsson. I'm the Dean of the Faculty for Science, Technology and Media at the Mid-Sweden University. Our faculty includes many subjects where sustainability is of high priority in most of the research questions addressed. One important department for research and education is the Department of Ecotechnology and Sustainable Building Engineering, located in Östersund campus at the Mid-Sweden University. If you would been here in Sweden, you will be at that location. Anyhow, here is some example on research there. Within the BioREM fiber research project, the goal is to develop market-adapted environmental technology to clean up fiber banks along the coast of Västernorrland with the help of fungi, plants, and bacteria, so-called bioremediation. This is some, how to say, from the past sins of industrialization that has grown the wealth of the region, but we also need to take care of in these days. The Equanor project aims to ensure the quality of our water bodies through analysis and tracking of E. coli bacteria and eDNA. It's related to the pressure of tourists in the inside of the outdoor and sports region that Östersund and Jämtland is in Sweden. Food tech is another research field of interest for several of our departments. In a sustainable world, we need to change our food industry and find alternative ways of producing, consuming, and communicating food. As I mentioned, Östersund is a central part when it comes to winter sport in Sweden. It's also growing when it comes to tourism in the summer. We have a larger program from Mistra Foundation, Sport and Outdoors, a Swedish collaboration program, aiming to generate knowledge and solutions to increase sustainability in sport and outdoor recreation. How can we continue to enjoy sport and outdoor activities and do this in a sustainable way? Tourism is an important industry and much loved social activity, and research are ongoing to understand and find ways to improve the sustainability of this industry. KM2 and is another project related to the question or the issue raised by Jeff when it comes to energy usage. We need to use more energy, and of course, one way is that we are able to store energy in various ways. And we are working with the paper industry product method in order to create square kilometer sized batteries and supercapacitor to store energy in various ways. In all research areas, there is aspects to consider regarding sustainability. Relevant questions can be found in all the subjects of our faculty: electronics, computer engineering, media and communication, quality management, design, engineering, physics, chemistry and chemical engineering, biology, informatics, computer science, as well as mathematics. Modeling is an important field to sharpen our understanding of global complex mechanisms and to allow more realistic future scenarios for decision making. It is with great satisfaction that I see such a broad scope of tracks in the online conference, and it's a great pleasure to be part of an online conference experience of this size. The team behind the conference has been working hard to provide an online format that can match your expectations, and I hope that you will enjoy spending this time with us at the Mid-Sweden University. As said often today, close but just a little bit further apart. Maybe this will be a more common way to organize scientific conference in the future. You are most welcome to us at the Mid-Sweden University, online as well as in real life, further on when this will be made possible, I hope. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you so much, Hans-Erik. Yes, we also have another speaker I want to say welcome, I think.
Thank you, Hans-Erik, also from my side, and also for pointing out the faculty and the department for our work. I was also thanking my prefect in the department, Nils Nielsen, for making this possible, and all the colleagues stepping in as co-chairs of the conference. So our next speaker is Peter Dovers, who is the current president of the International Society for Sustainable Development Research, and I would welcome Peter and ask him for his words of welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Volker. I would like to begin by thanking you all for attending the conference and praising you all for all the different efforts that you have put into research in sustainable development and making a conference like ISDRS 2021 possible, by writing abstracts and full papers, by facilitating tracks as track chairs and reviewing abstracts and full papers, by accepting to address our community as invited keynotes and panelists, by organizing the academic and the administrative sides of a conference such as ours, and by giving young scholars and PhD students the wonderful opportunity of a full day's workshop with 50+ participants from PhD students and 30 seniors yesterday. ISDRS is a prospering society. About 500 registered participants we have heard for our second online conference is a solid, and I would say a very good number. With about 2,750 followers on LinkedIn, just as one example, and about the same that have signed up for our newsletters, we are happy to help spreading your research in many different ways. All of you help making the world a little bit more enlightened. Our students, business leaders, civil society, policymakers and politicians equipped with more relevant knowledge and competences to help transform societies throughout the world into more just and more equal societies, into societies that take on the underlying problems of climate change, and into societies that actually live within the limits of our one planet. By that, I would like to welcome you all and thank you again for making this wonderful and highly relevant community prosper. Thanks again to Katrin, Inger, Hans-Erik, and Volker and their team for a wonderful start. And I hand over the screen and mic to Katrin and Volker again in the studio.
Thank you, Peter, for your kind words of introduction and welcome. I want also to thank all our board colleagues at ISDRS, in the executive board, in the board, for stepping in when we came up with this somehow strange idea, in short term arrange a conference in October 2020 for summer 2021. And many of the colleagues really showed great support in the ISDRS organizing committee and towards the end of 2020, and then stepped in as co-chairs, chairs of sessions. And even yesterday night, I convinced one colleague to step in to help another colleague out. So it was really a common work also from the ISDRS board, and that's also very grateful for this. Without further ado, I want to show you some achievements of our students, because our students, when they heard there's a conference, they said, okay, we can do something. And what we have learned here at Mid-Sweden University, actually, we can make a calculation how much CO2 has been saved by not coming to Mid-Sweden. Unfortunately, perhaps for many of us, would have been a great vacation here. It's a great summertime here, but our students said, let's calculate what we can save by doing it online. And we hand over now to our students. They have prepared a little presentation for 5 minutes. So please, Anna and Bella. And it's an international team, I have to mention. So we are very international with our master program also at the department. So we have 2 students from different countries who give now the presentation here on this topic. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Anna Rydberg, and I'm a student at the Entrepreneur for Sustainable Future here at the Mid-Sweden University. And this is Bela.
Hello, my name is Bela Setolushi, and I'm also a student at the master program Ecotechnology and Sustainable Development at Mid-Sweden University.
Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. So we have done a case study of the emissions that could have been caused by the ISDRS conference 2021. We like to call it emissions that have never occurred. We are a part of the Student Network for Sustainability here at Mid-Sweden University. We would like to thank everyone that has helped us during this project, and especially Torbjörn Schwitt, that has been our supervisor.
How diverse a conference can be. With that, I want to introduce you to our topic, because at the status when we calculated this, it was 403 participants which were expected to come here, coming from 43 nations and 6 continents. As you can see on the map, it's quite diverse. Since now you will mainly sit in front of your laptops, but we ask ourselves, how would it be if you actually would fly here, and how much CO2 would it emit to come here? And secondly, we wanted to know and how much CO2 does actually the digital conference emit?
So our method was that we took the participating list of all of you that are attending the conference. We then chose the main airports. We are aware that some of you would have traveled from smaller airports as well, but we chose to do the main airports. We then took the best option flights at Skyscanner, and we took in this into the emission calculator provided by the UN. We have assumed that all of the Swedish participants would have taken the train to Östersund, so they have not been part of the calculation. For the digital conference, we have used the same participating list. We have then taken an average energy consumption per laptop, the time in use to get the emission per kilowatt hour.
Coming to our results. So the flights would have caused in total 116,000 kilograms CO2 emissions, which is an average 300 kilograms CO2 emissions per person. In contrast, the digital conference, what we calculated was a total emissions of 1,300 kilogram, which accounts for around 3 kilogram per person. A side effect is that we haven't traveled 3,700,000 kilometers.
It is quite a difficult topic to calculate an exact result, and we've had a few different questions during the time that we made this small case study. We've been thinking that maybe more participants have joined due to the conference being online instead of physical, as it's more easy both financially and time-wise. We've been thinking about the indirect positive effect that might occur as a result of this conference. We also think that the laptop or computers that we all are using would still have been in use even though not participating in the conference. We have also seen that other emission calculators have led to different results, and we've done a small comparison here. The reason why we chose the UN one was because it's not provided by an airline, and we thought that would be a bit more safer to use.
So we compared the emissions of the flights that would have been taken if it would be in Östersund with the digital conference emissions of the laptops in use. And we found there is a difference of 114,700 kilograms of CO2 that would have been saved by this conference. But we cannot say that we saved that because these emissions never occurred. Instead, we produced 1,300 kilograms CO2.
Thank you so much for listening, and we hope that you will enjoy the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna and Bela, and thank you for being so positive, creating energy in the student network of sustainable development at Mid-Sweden University. So now we are on to a well-deserved break, and we will go to the parallel sessions at 11:30. Before doing that, I will just remind you not to forget about the poster session during the lunch break. And depending on what your wishes are to which session you want to attend, you will find the different links to the different panels in the program on the website. As you said, Volker, the colorful program. So please enjoy the parallel sessions and the break, and we will be back here in the studio and see you after lunch. Bye.
Okay, but it's I'm muted still. I'm not muted. Okay. Ms. Wehrma, thank you for being with us. I cannot see any video at the moment, but I see that you are also in the chat mentioned that participants. Thank you very much for spending your time with us and for giving us even 90 minutes of your valuable time. And we are very glad to have you with us. I hope it's not too early in the morning also with you. So welcome.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's only 8, about to around 8.
Yeah. That's the difference to Vancouver time zone. I didn't realize that Tian is in Vancouver actually. So we put her to 4 o'clock in the morning for early start into the day. Sorry, Tian, again. Yeah, but great. Thank you for everybody to join in time. And I just explained we do start with you, Ms. Wehrma, and that would be 15 minutes talk, and then just 5 minutes question.
Welcome back in the studio of the 27th International Conference of Sustainable Development. There were some nice pictures of the city of Östersund, and we're actually sitting here in the studio on the campus, but we haven't been here for 1.5 years now, Volker. But we still wanted to give you a glimpse of the pulse of Östersund, where we are right now. So we hope that you had a good morning. We have had a keynote speech by Professor Jeffrey Sachs this morning, and we just got back from parallel sessions. For some of you around the world, it might be very early in the morning and time for breakfast. We just enjoyed our lunch here, and for some of you, it might be already dinner, since this is a very international conference and you are all over the globe. We are looking forward now to a very interesting plenary discussion with 3 plenary speakers. And the format of this session is that each of the plenary speakers have 15 minutes for an individual talk. And then you will have the opportunity to ask questions of understanding and clarification if there was something that was not clear of the speak. And then we will have a common plenary discussion among the 3 plenary speakers. And in the end, you will have the opportunity to ask more questions on the content of the speeches, and we will have more discussion. And for this session, we welcome you to pose your questions in the chat, where we will accommodate all your questions and try to answer them within this time. So now over to Volker, that will introduce our first keynote speaker.
Thank you very much. And we have the afternoon, as mentioned, under the overall topic of environmental sustainability, and I'm happy to have really 3 eminent persons here, key persons, global figures in the terms of environmental sustainability. You know already the program, but it's our Elisabeth Bremer. She's Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity based in Montreal in Canada. Then we have also Hans Brinnings here. He's the Executive Director of the European Environmental Agency based in Copenhagen. And as a third speaker, we have Yen Nigo, who worked as Chief Technical Director for IPBES for a long time, for the global assessment particularly also, and is now in the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organizations of the United Nations, as expert active. So I would like to ask Elisabeth Bremer to share her slides with us, share her talk with us, and I really welcome Elisabeth. She became recently Executive Director, not that recently perhaps, but please, the floor is yours, Elisabeth, and it's really an honor that you share with us 90 minutes of your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have the slides, but I will speak from my notes and will be ready then to respond to questions at the end at the allocated time as you have indicated. I hope you can hear me. Can you confirm if you can hear me?
We hear you well.
Yes.
Thank you. So dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first I'd like to thank the International Sustainable Development Research Society and Mid Sweden University for this opportunity to contribute to your 27th conference in 2021 under the theme of accelerating progress towards sustainable development goals in time of crisis. As a long-time partner of the convention, the society brings important ideas to an urgent issue. Nature is still being lost at unprecedented rates. Unfortunately, we are spending at least 10 times more to degrade our ecosystems than we are protecting it. Sadly, it is still business as usual. Financial and economic policy environments and the systems deciding on designing and operations in those sectors are still driving extinctions. The curve has not yet begun to bend. It is not just the nature that we can see. Every atom of oxygen we breathe in is produced by life, as is all the food we consume. The wood from forest sustain us from cradle to grave. Regardless of our incredible advancements, ultimately, every medicine we use was raised from our interaction with other species. The benefits of a healthy nature are very clear. Water that is filtered and purified by forests, wetlands, lakes, and rivers is 10 times less costly than a drink that is processed by human systems. If you live within 50 meters of a green area in your city, your immune system gets stronger simply by passing by the park every day. And if you stay and exercise, you can reduce developing non-communicable diseases. Many scientists have highlighted the strong links between human health, the COVID pandemic, and the sustainable uses of nature. These issues are critically urgent for us today, as will become worse in 10 to 20 years' time if we fail to act now. It is also crucial and critical to realize that if the causes of the loss of nature and land, as well as climate change and pollution, are interlinked, so are the solutions. CEOs or chief executive officers are saying it. Bankers like Mr. Sukhdev and economists like Dasgupta are proving it. Celebrities like Greta Thunberg and Russian hockey hero Salva Fetizov repeat it over and over again. The other factor we hear is that solutions need to be multi-stakeholder, truly crossing all sectors of society. We are all responsible, so we must cooperate to solve the clear and present danger of this loss. Let me be clear. This is about you and me, now and here. I can tell you that the UN or United Nations is listening. The 196 parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity are working diligently to design a wide-ranging and coherent set of targets and indicators and a vision and mission for the next 10 years called the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Only yesterday, we launched the first draft of this framework, which is now available out there and also on our website for your review and contribution as we continue to further develop it. We cooperate with relevant players from all sectors and levels of government and society. People everywhere are speaking up and getting involved in trying to secure a better future for us all. Thus, we need solutions that transcend political barriers, a menu of options that are simultaneously science-based, ambitious, feasible, and measurable. This is your job. We are the platform that is actively asking for those integrated, holistic, participative, and feasible approaches. You are one of our partners that can provide answers for the national, subnational, and local governments that work with us and do the business and financial decision makers that listen to and interact with the convention's agenda and the outcomes. You are unique, the world's best scientists. You combine the objectivity of science to tell you or tell us where we are and where we are going at every cycle. You do possess the wisdom of setting the goals and changing them if necessary towards what is required and what you have the passion needed to succeed. It will not be easy, definitely. You can and need to combine what you can say with actionable certainty today with what decision makers need to know in order to act before it is too late. We need science that can help the transformative, robust, and ambitious goals and targets of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This will be quite a task. Of course, most of those speaking today are already working on this theme. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, our main partner in helping national governments find ways towards a sustainable food systems for land and sea, and towards the sustainable management of our forests as development and climate resilience assets play major role in offering science-based models, as do the European Environmental Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, Future Earth, and other science and knowledge generating agencies. Science will need to be at the best of the solutions you are pursuing. And we look forward to the outcomes of this dialogue as we continue to discuss on these important sustainability issues moving forward. We are told this is our last decade. We either make it or perish with it. But if we perish, me and you about to retire, what will it be for our children and those yet to be born, whom we need to leave a clean, sustainable planet for them to equally enjoy in their future? Thank you very much.
Elizabeth, for your very personal words and sharing your vision and your perspective with regard also to this wider field of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and sustainable resource use. And I'm glad that you also emphasized the long-term relationship between the CBD Secretariat and ISDRS, because we in the past participated in the COPs of the CBD regularly, and also had in 2018 in Sharm el-Sheikh a co-event organized, particularly on the science policy interface, to bring the latest science also to the policymakers. So, and that event was really quite successful. We could address many people, bring up new partnerships. So I was very happy that we went there, and the plan is again to go to the next COP. Hopefully it's not only online, but on site again. So let's see. Great, thank you for your words. And I wonder if we had any hints in the questions of understanding. We ask you for questions of understanding only. Or what type of? We have one type.
What type of science do you think we need more urgently? Is the first question.
We can take it instead of questions of understanding.
We need all the science needed to ensure that we can halt and reverse the continued biodiversity loss. Over 1 million species face extinction. Over 75% of the land has been degraded. 66% of the sea or marine environment has been polluted. We choke the ocean with plastics. So we really need the science to help us solve this environmental degradation, which continues in front of our eyes. And the scientists, the recent reports, be it of science reports, be economic reports, be health-related reports, all are giving us the bad news. So we know the problems. We equally know the solutions. What we are missing is to take the needed action now to reverse the further biodiversity loss. So the science has already told us very clear, and we know it. And all the recent reports are mentioning it. Action is what is needed to move from rhetoric to actionable actions on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you for a great question. And I think it's really about managing biodiversity is very much managing people, yeah? Because it's not the biodiversity which is the problem, but it's us actually which is the problem with our consumption and production patterns, and managing the people's mind, changing the minds of the people. And then the politicians will also change when they realize that the people want them to act. So that's one of the main fields of science perhaps which we really have to address. Yeah. Thank you so much for your input, and for also thanks for the question from Santiago. And if there are no further questions yet, we can also have in the general discussion then more questions to Elizabeth. And we might continue just in the program with Hans Brünnings. He's, as I mentioned, the Executive Director of the European Environmental Agency, which provides expertise, particularly also for the European Union, but also for many countries, other countries. And Hans and me have a long-term relationship because we met randomly actually in a European Union project, 2005 in Romania. We were both not in our positions which we have yet, but we had a very good collaboration in Romania, and I remember a very nice dinner in a very old building in Romania with a nice chat. So, and then we moved our ways, and the ways crossed several times since then. And I'm very happy that we could gain Hans for our meeting here and could give also a talk of 15 minutes. Hans, please, the floor is yours, and glad you are with us.
Thank you, Volker, and hi to all. It's a pleasure to be with you and to engage in exchange with you as a scientific community. I will share my screen. Yes. Now I go to the slideshow modus and now I should be ready to speak to you as it is supposed to happen. I will focus on the European Green Deal and the promise it holds for more fundamental systemic sustainability transitions in Europe, because I think that is really the question of the time. How do we not try to fix in the margins, but ask the serious questions about the unsustainability of the current systems of production and consumption, and how we can change those towards fundamental sustainability. And the starting point, as always, and I'm glad that Elizabeth referred to it, of course, is knowledge. It's science. And in this case, I don't need to introduce the IPCC. We all know what they are about. We are fortunate to have a lot of representation from the biodiversity and ecosystem services community, IPBES, and the messages that Elizabeth referred to. I would also like to emphasize the International Resource Panel. It's probably the lesser known panel, but that looks at the way in which we use resources in our economy and the impact that has on biodiversity and on climate change, and of course the impacts of the environmental degradation on our health. And if you look at the panels and the reports coming from those organizations, they sent a very similar message. First of all, we are living in times of urgency if we want to turn things around. So we're in a pivotal decade, the window is closing. Secondly, and I think this is underestimated, we're already dealing with irreversibility. So we are in a stage where we are dealing with permanent damage. We are seeing tipping points in the Earth system. So we don't know when, how, where a new equilibrium of sorts might be. And on top of that, these problems are interconnected. So if we fail on climate, we will fail on biodiversity and the other way around. Resource use is central, and they all are linked to our health. Now, at the global level, the response to this sort of setting has been framed as the Sustainable Development Goals. And given your community, I don't need to say anything about the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, you could tell me much more about them than I could to you. But I've added Sustainable Development Goals again, and that's what I want to emphasize. I think it's fair to say that about 30 years ago, we also had SDGs. They were called Agenda 21. They were called the Rio Declaration. If you reread those texts and you modernize the language a bit and you upgrade them a bit, it's almost exactly the same package. So the real question for me is, what is it we are going to do fundamentally different in the next 3 decades that evidently and apparently we haven't been doing the past 3 decades? Although the science and knowledge was fundamentally there, the commitment under a UN umbrella was there, but we didn't do it. So that is an essential question. And I think the European Green Deal is partially the European answer to this. And so the question is this really a paradigm shift in politics and policy that is responsive to this context and that is fundamentally different from what we've seen in the past? Well, there are several things to say about this. The European Green Deal is the engine, I would say, of the current European institutions project. That is rather different from a previous commission, where in fact in the Juncker Commission, in the key document, the word environment wasn't even mentioned. I would be lying to you if I didn't say it was mentioned as business environment. but not in the way we understand it. And so you have that starting point. You also have a number of objectives that are clearly the most ambitious that have ever been put on paper in the EU system. A climate neutral continent, a biodiversity strategy that is world leading, and I'll say something about that, a circular economy action plan that puts this concept into practice, zero pollution, a farm to fork strategy. Then also the link, I would say, with the social dimension very explicitly for the first time in Just Transition, and then the link with the financial system and our industrial strategy. So I'll come back to a number of those. Also in the text, it says that this is our most pressing challenge. It's our greatest responsibility. It talks about Europe in the lead of the transition, and transition in science, of course, has a particular understanding. So this is a link to the type of policies that should emerge based on these objectives. And it even in the first sentence speaks about existential threats. Now I can tell you in the EU system, the word existential threats is not easily used. So it is clearly a sort of new beginning when it comes to these themes. And if you read this from a knowledge perspective, it is clear that it is beyond a Green Deal, also the priority for Europe in a political project, in economic decisions and investment. That is how it is framed. It has a very strong systemic transitions logic embedded in the goals. There is a link with sectoral policies, but in a very new way, not to green them a bit, but to transition them towards different types of sectors. The interconnected nature is essential. There is a very long time horizon for policy making settings, 2030 as a stepping stone to 2050. There's this social dimension, and there is a clear link to an innovation and digitalization agenda and a governance agenda. And so at the agency, we say this ambitious, innovative, interconnected, and systemic policy agenda has to be matched by the same ambitions on the knowledge side. Let's dive a little bit into some of these elements. The European climate law with the -55 by 2030 and the climate neutrality by 2050 is screaming for a different style of politics. Because if we look at 1990, the reference year towards today, and you look from now to 2050, we will have to speed up the annual rate of reduction in emissions by 2.7. Now, that is not possible with the current trajectories, current policies, current fixes. So we will need more transitional style policies. The same is there for the biodiversity strategy, which in essence moved away from this thinking of halting biodiversity loss. And by the way, we failed for over 2 decades there, to the restoration target. Now, that is a much more ambitious target, and that requires a really different approach. So that means different type of policies and different types of instruments as well. In the circular economy, the action plan talks about make sustainable products the norm in the EU and not 5% of the shelves in your supermarket that require a label. No, this should become the norm. Again, we are rather far away from what that looks like. So this requires, again, a different approach. The zero pollution ambition, which I think is absolutely critical and now translated and linked to the chemicals sector, which requires a transition. The link to the use of pesticides in agriculture, which will be cut in the next decade by more than 50%. So that type of elements is clearly there. And why are they there? Well, if we look at our own state and outlook of the environment report of 2020 and what we call the piano of the European environment, and every key is a set of policies for which we have data, you look at the past trends and it's a sort of mixed picture, but natural capital, which is clearly the foundational capital, is we see the most red. And when we look at the outlook for 2030, we clearly see the green disappear. Now, Europe has probably the most ambitious, most well-developed, and also most binding policy setting. And if this is the outlook, yeah, it's obvious that this is the message that is screaming from it. Bouw Business as usual is no longer an option, and not even business as usual plus, and that it's better implementation. So we need to shift gears. Shifting gears, in our understanding, means catalyzing systemic change. And we focus primarily on the food system, the energy system, the mobility system, and the built environment, which provide for human health, well-being, and also are linked to social cohesion in their distributional aspects. Now, if you plead for systemic transitions, you need to understand some of the scope of this. And for us, this is about the very deep character. This is not messing around in the margins, understanding that there are no silver bullets to these complex challenges, understanding the deep lock-ins that we see in social practices and paradigms, and also understanding the barriers to fundamental change. And let me briefly illustrate some of these. One of the silver bullets that we see across the board and in the mobility system in particular is, let's make the current technology a bit more efficient, the efficiency paradigm. Well, that didn't really work because we keep adding greenhouse gases and keep polluting. So we thought there was another silver bullet, the biofuels. Well, we all know by now that if we would have done what some people were telling us to do in biofuels, we would have had very serious issues to deal with today. Now, the other plan would be to let's keep the whole system, but just change the engine. Well, even then, this would be the Rue de la Loi in Brussels, the Wetstraat, about 15 hours a day. So maybe the most innovative part of this image is this little guy on a bicycle here. So if you look at a systemic perspective, maybe this is the type of mobility in a city of 1.5 million, which is not Brussels, but Copenhagen, where I'm located, and where we understand that urban transitions require a very different type of policies, because of course, the money and the technology are exactly the same in Brussels as they are in Copenhagen. It's the vision, the ambition, the policies that make the difference. Another silver bullet is often mentioned as the digital. Digital will solve it. Well, that depends on what type of digital. There is quite a debate going on that in the EU. Sustainable digital economy is part of the discussion. Another element that we've used in the past is policy integration, EPI, environmental policy integration, the Cardiff process, all of that. Well, we know that this has been largely unsuccessful. One of the most flagrant cases is, of course, agriculture, where the greening of the CAP has shown to be largely ineffective. And this is nitrogen depositions across Europe, but I could have shown you other maps as well. That leads me to the lock-ins. And we all know that the food system is problematic and that we are dealing with serious lock-ins there in the financial system, but also in the sort of industrialization, overfishing, underpaying of farmers, all of those elements we need to understand if we really want to change the system. And even if we do, we seem to come with solutions that may pose new risks. And this is what I label medium-termism. If you look at the debate around natural gas as a so-called transition energy towards zero carbon, we did a careful analysis of lock-ins across all the the electricity plants in Europe. And by 2030, about 20% of them risk to be stranded assets. So this 2030 perspective as a medium-term solution could pose serious issues over the longer term. The whole idea of the Green Deal also forces us to rethink the fundamentals. And this is not a Mendeleev table in the traditional sense. It's one that is created by Paul Anastas and Zimmermann, two of the founding people of green chemistry. And they say, look, the current model of chemistry regime needs to go through a fundamental discussion because the current molecules that we use are not compatible with the objectives of zero carbon. They are not compatible with the objectives of a circular economy, nor with zero pollution or human health. So this is a fundamental sector that needs to change as well. All of this also means, in my opinion, that we need to go to the core of the system. And let's talk about the finance system. And here, having lived in the US, they are a bit less apologetic. They talk about capitalism. We in Europe, we tend to talk about the mixed economy or the market economy, but let's call it capitalism. It would be a bit strange to expect radically different outcomes in a system called capitalism without talking about capital. Yeah, that seems a bit strange to me. So that is what Europe is doing through the Sustainable Finance Initiative. It is the first time that any region at that scale is actually talking about investments in that way, and the taxonomy will be driving some changes there. And to illustrate the changes, I think it's clear that if we want to invest in sustainability, we should not invest in dead-end streets, and that is marginal efficiency gains in the systems we know, because any economist will tell you that marginal efficiencies are increasingly costly, and any engineer will say that they have a sort of tangential limit. So they will end in stranded assets, and I would also say in stranded regions and probably stranded workers. So what we need to do is to make investments that are really future oriented. And we think that the sustainable finance taxonomy can at least push from the red line to the green line, as does some choices in the EU budget, the stimulus fund, and some brave decisions by the European Investment Bank, for example, which moved away completely from fossil fuel investments. It also means that we need to have the courage to come with some fundamental debates that have been there in science, but not so much welcomed in policy. And in the agency, we have a series of publications called Narratives for Change. The first one was labeled Growth Without Economic Growth, Living Well Within the Limits of the Planet. It put this debate squarely on the table as an EU institution. I can say that not everybody was equally enthusiastic that we did it, but I think that is the role of an institution that has a certain independence and wants to connect science to policy and policy objectives. It also means that we need to understand the so-called X-curve of systemic change. And of course, we like to focus on the optimistic curve of experimentation, acceleration, institutionalization, and then we end up in a more sustainable position. We think it's equally important to focus on what we should be phasing out, what we should be breaking down, and why that is not happening at the same rate. And that examples, you all know them: fossil fuels, environmentally harmful subsidies. We've been discussing those for 20 years without much progress. Unsustainable tax systems, unsustainable spatial planning, all of those elements are critical. And that means we could expect conflicts in society, and that means we need to come with enabling conditions or legislation, binding targets to speed up and scale up not only the green arrow, but also the red arrow. My final slide: is the European Green Deal therefore a paradigm shift in politics and policy? I think yes, if we take the ambitious targets seriously and we translate them in concrete packages, like the climate law, the Fit for 55 package, new targets in a number of areas. But the devil is often in the implementation and also in the pushback. It is clear that there is quite a bit of pushback from vested interests in that, or from people who don't think this is realistic. Of course, the opposite is not realistic, because continuing with fundamentally unsustainable trajectories, well, we know where that will end from science. And I would say yes, and if this is not just a project, even if it is successful, that takes place on an Eurasian subcontinent that is increasingly small in terms of the European economy and population. So having a global perspective, I do think, will be absolutely necessary. So I'm optimistic about the targets and the general direction. The needle on the compass is clear. I'm a realist when it comes to implementation and to science, and that is exactly also the role that we want to play as a European Environment Agency, providing support that is science and knowledge based, but with a critical view on those things that require political and policy attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hans, for sharing all these latest data from the European Environmental Agency and your view. You are known as one who speaks out really the problematic issues like those needs for systemic changes. And I have to mention also that you have a long-term relationship with ISDRS, as you were also one of our keynote speakers in the Lisbon conference, I think about 5 years ago. So thanks again for coming again to us and bringing the problems really to the point again. Thank you so much. I do not see.
No, I don't think we
questions,
have any questions of understanding yet. So we have a few questions coming into the chat, and you're really welcome to post those questions. We will come back to the questions of content when all speakers have been talking.
Okay.
So I think we can move on to the next speaker.
And the speakers have also the opportunity to directly see your questions and perhaps also directly answer them in the chat already. So let's continue with the next speaker, and I'm really pleased to welcome Hien Ngo. Hien is really an experienced expert in these issues because she worked extremely much with the Intergovernmental Panel for our ecosystem biodiversity and ecosystem services, IPBES. She was responsible as technical expert for all the thematic reports, but also for the global report, which was in the slides of Hans and which was also mentioned by Maria. And she's a person who almost never sleep, I have to say, because I had the honor to work with her for 1 year. I was a coordinating lead author in that global report, and I think there was no daytime where we didn't communicate with each other. 10,000 emails felt like. So, Hien, thank you for being with us. I thought you were in Rome, but you're in Vancouver, so sorry for the early morning time, which you interact with us now on your side, and the floor is yours. Welcome to our conference.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Oops.
Yeah. And
Can you
Hien is
confirm that
currently
you
with
can
the
see my screen?
We can
Okay.
see your screen, and I forgot to mention that Hien is currently with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations as an expert.
Thank you, Volker. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. My name is Hien Ngo, and I'd first like to thank Volker and Inger and the organizing committee and also the International Sustainable Development Research Society for inviting me to present today. Also, my distinguished co-panelists here to field any of the harder questions on policy. I'm very happy to be with you. So the title of my talk, as you can see here, is Meeting the Challenges of Biodiversity Conservation Through the Science Policy Interface, but I should have named my talk exactly what Elizabeth had said, just simply we need science, because I am going to talk about the channels through which science and knowledge can really inform policymaking. As Volker said, my previous position with IPBES in the last 7 years was the head of the technical support unit for the Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And recently I've moved to the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So again, happy to be with you. My first slide, and again, I'm happy that Elizabeth is here because she could field any of the CBD questions. Really, I'm going to touch on each entity because I'm going to be talking about the science policy interface. So IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity in Ecosystem Services, the Convention on Biological Diversity and FAO are more policy leaning, but I'll talk about how IPBES works with the CBD and also how FAO works with the CBD. So if you've been following IPBES and its work, it is currently in its second work program, rolling up to 2030. The first work program was from 2014 to 2019. It's a relatively young entity, but in the first work program and also in the second work program, the overall objective has always been the same. It's to strengthen that science policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being, and sustainable development. IPBES has just finished a few weeks ago its 8th plenary session, meeting of the governments of its member states to discuss various aspects of its second work program. So within the 4 functions of IPBES, there are 6 objectives. I won't read them all, but I'm most familiar with assessing knowledge. The 2030 work program initially focuses on 3 topics. One is the understanding of the importance of biodiversity in achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The second one is the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and determinants of transformative change and options for achieving the 2050 vision for biodiversity of the CBD. And the third one is business impact and dependence on biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. So touching on some of those things that Hans also just presented on. So there will be, and it has been approved for undertaking, an assessment on transformative change, which is really talking about the systemic drivers of change and how we can assess those to affect nature and its contributions to people. And also he mentioned a bit about the financial and business sector, for which there will be a methodological assessment looking at indicators for business and their impacts on biodiversity. So very relevant to the 2 talks that were just done. Oops. So assessing knowledge through reports and assessments to inform policymakers and decision-making is obviously not new. Elizabeth and Hans both talked about the legacy of a lot of reports out there. I'm missing a lot on this slide. For example, the TEEB reports that Elizabeth was talking about, and also the Dasgupta review, the global sustainability reports. So with this snapshot of the landscape of global assessments, just wanted to flag out there that this is not new. Assessments for decision-making and evidence for decision makers. IPBES is relatively new in the game with the first thematic assessment on pollination that was approved in 2016, for which I was involved as the technical support unit as well, and also a methodological assessment on scenarios and models approved in 2016. The first work program really culminated and finished with the global assessment, which was approved in 2019. And it's really the largest product that IPBES has generated in its short existence to date. So the global assessment was an effort over the last 3 years from 2016 to 2019, for which Volker was also involved. It had 6 chapters in the full assessment, which is available, and 1 summary for policymaker, which was approved word for word in 2019. It involved 150 experts from 51 countries and was led by 3 esteemed co-chairs, which you see on the screen: Eduardo Brandizio, Joseph Setterly, and Sandra Diaz. Now, when we talk about its impact, so after its approval in 2019 in May, really the reach was overwhelming, and you see here a few statistics that I've shown up here. It was approximately 38,000 articles online in 171 countries, reaching 50 languages, with a likely reach of over 1 billion views. But when we talk about the science policy interface and the impact on the biodiversity agenda, here I have a photo of Macron. So in the G7 Environmental Summit in August of that very year of the approval of the global assessment, Macron pushed for a biodiversity charter, citing the impetus as being the global assessment. But how else does IPBES and other science policy interfaces and entities really impact the biodiversity agenda? So specifically here, I've stolen this schematic from David Cooper, who's the Deputy Executive Secretary of the CBD, showing you how the new strategic plan and the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework is informed by science and knowledge. So this is just a snapshot and it's simplified. There are many, many other sources, but as you can see, information about NBSEP implementation, the 6 national reports, and all of information about indicators is also there, but a large proportion that feeds into the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5th edition really comes from IPBES, and a key player was the IPBES Global Assessment. And as Elizabeth has mentioned, this has all led to the resulting post-2020 first draft Global Biodiversity Framework, which was just released last Monday, July 12th, which was based on all of this science and all of this evidence. So this is really just also a snapshot of how the science policy interface, its outputs, the assessments, work with policy, and also in assessing nature. So assessments of nature and its contributions to people are intended to influence policy practices and management, but also assessments are most effective when done in collaboration with policymakers and decision makers. So that blue arrow really shows the collaborative effort in formulating what is needed in terms of assessments. And so assessments will inform policy. Of course, that policy influences the state of nature, as Hans has just presented. And then again, the new state of nature would be assessed after that. So that was really about IPBES, its assessments, its ties to the CBD. But since IPBES, I've really moved on to the Food and Agriculture Organization, but I still maintain my work in evidence building with experts to provide information to decision makers. So FAO is a United Nations specialized agency that leads on international efforts to defeat hunger and improve nutrition and food security. But beyond that, it has many core functions. I will not read the slide, but as you can see, it looks at implementation at a national level, data and information building and access, capacity development, but also the policy dialogue to facilitate and promote and support that dialogue at a country level and above. This year, amidst the Conference of the Parties, 15th session meeting, and also COP26 of the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, there's also the 18th session of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture of the United Nations, which happens at the end of October. Now, the CGRFA, excuse me for the acronyms, is the only international forum that deals with all components of biodiversity for food and agriculture. And at this meeting of the governments to FAO, we'll also be discussing a lot of cross-cutting issues that were mentioned by the previous two speakers. So this link with biodiversity for food and agriculture with nutrition and human health, climate change, access and benefit sharing, digital sequence information, biotechnologies, et cetera, et cetera. This is my penultimate slide. I just wanted to really re-emphasize that science policy interfaces are committed to producing assessments as one of the functions for evidence-based reports that will continue to inform decision-making. Likewise, with FAO and all of its work, it provides policy and technical advice to member countries in the field of agriculture, livestock, fisheries, forestry, and nutrition, all based on the principles of really being credible, policy relevant or relevant, and legitimate. This is what drives kind of that machinery about informing decision makers. And I will continue to do that in my work, and hopefully IPBES and FAO will continue as well. So I want to close by thanking all of you for your attention. My talk was on a smaller scale compared to Elizabeth and Hans's talk, but I was happy to share a bit about my work and the science policy interface in informing policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jen. It was great listening to your experience, and we are now going to move into the panel discussion. And just to get you all three started in this, I really appreciated all you talking about the urgency that we need to face and to start working on the action. I also appreciate it very much that you talk about the narratives for change and phasing out damage So my first prompt to you three plenary speeches would be: we have a lot of knowledge, as we were talking about, Jen. We know we have the knowledge. We know the goal. We want to create a healthy planet. But what types of strategic communication drives the action according to your experiences? That would be my first question to you, plenary speakers.
Well, I'm happy to start because it's actually, this is a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Huh?
Yeah.
I think the role of a knowledge institution is to connect the best new science to an existing, what I call knowledge infrastructure architecture that is specialized in bringing that to policymakers. And that can be public policymakers or, as far as I'm concerned, private policymakers as well, because big companies have policies as well. That's, by the way, why they call them corporate policies, probably. So that is a specific set of skills in and of itself. And I think you can do agenda setting in that way. We, with the Environment Agency, have been focusing on systemic change for about a decade now. And we've been reaching out with impact to a number of layers in the EU system. And we think that has had an impact on this European Green Deal. By the way, our State and Outlook of the Environment report is the only report that is mentioned as the knowledge base in the European Green Deal. So it takes time, and I also think that putting the essential stuff on the table, even if it is not so pleasant to hear, like this emphasis on what we should stop doing. Yeah, and I see there's a question in the chat as well. I don't think we emphasize enough what we should stop doing. And putting evidence on the table of why that is the case, why there is so little progress, for example, in the greening of tax systems, why there is so little progress in phasing out of environmentally harmful subsidies. And a third element for me is very clearly to not be lured into reductionist approaches. I always say that the real challenge for people like you and like ourselves is not to simplify systemic reality or complexity. The real challenge is to bring complexity in an understandable way. And that's a very different thing, because I think we are guilty if we reduce complexity too much, because then we suggest to policymakers that there are fewer buttons maybe that they should focus on, or that, you know, the issues are not so difficult as they seem. So yeah, those would be some first responses to that. And to do this well, I always say we should focus not only on people who are an inch wide and a mile deep in their science. We need those as well. But I'm focusing also, when we recruit people, on what I call connectors, people who see the connections and who can communicate those. And that doesn't mean we're looking for people that are an inch deep and a mile wide. That's not the same thing. But we all know that some researchers with very deep knowledge have that sort of additional skill or almost personality to make those connections and to communicate them, and maybe others don't. And that's not a value judgment, but we need quite a few of that second category to do this type of work well, I think. Sorry to be so verbose, but this is so close to what we do on a day-to-day basis. Okay, thanks.
So any feedback from you, Elizabeth or Jen, on Katrin's answer on the communication side?
Thank you very much. That's a useful question. I think what is important moving forward is really to communicate with the people. Many times we speak to the converted in the sense of hardcore scientists, hardcore economists, and the like, and basically then talking to ourselves and not the ones who have the responsibility to make a difference on the ground. So all the science policy frameworks already in place, also the different reports which Ian has mentioned at length, we need to translate that to the common man's language. And in that translation is really to be able to make the links and connection between these high level science policy issues to what it means to me as an individual and me as an individual on the ground. Because when we talk of biodiversity and nature, are the things we live with on a day-to-day basis. And yet we still speak many times, make a mistake of really speaking and writing those difficult issues which a common person might not understand. And I think that's the shift we need to make, because if each individual has to make a difference, then they need to really translate that difference into their day-to-day work. When we talk of, as I said in my statement, our visit walking around the parks on the daily basis, what nature provides us in terms of medicine, what nature provides us as food. So we need the people to connect these issues we are talking about to their day-to-day life and to be able to say, oh, if my agricultural production is not sustainable, I will miss food. If my environment is polluted, then my water will be polluted, and that will affect my health, and that will affect the government expenditure on hospitals or health program and the like. So that circle, they really need to connect it to them to be able to make that difference. So even in our case, I mentioned yesterday we launched the post-2020 framework, but once it is adopted, then it will need to be translated and translated in different ways to really make it usable to everybody on the society, especially when you say its implementation will be universal. It's universal because it will be universal because each and every individual will need to play a role to make it implementable and to make it actionable, and therefore at the end of the decade to really make a difference. So translate, we should stop talking to ourselves. We need to translate all our science policy issues into the language understood by our communities across the world. Thank you.
So just to add on top of that, I have no disagreements with Elizabeth and Hans, and I fully agree with them on both aspects. The difficulty, I agree with Hans on not reducing or simplifying any of these things, but the difficulty is that I think to date we haven't struck that balance between being able to communicate to many different sectors of society and stakeholders without being reductionist. So it's like, I agree, but what is the path there really to communicate those types of things? I think with my experience with IPBES, I think we did a really good job of communicating some of the hard science in more digestible forms, such as like the 1 million species threatened with extinction. There's things that people can connect with and really relate to more easily than the textbook kind of key findings that we used to do. But so anyways, just a small comment and saying I agree, but it's a hard path to get there, I think, in terms of communication.
Thank you.
Do you allow me to build on something that Elizabeth has said? Because I think she raised a really important point, and it is how do you reach citizens? How do you I think there are two elements for me. I'm so glad, Elizabeth, that you spoke about citizens and people and not about consumers, because that is sort of the language that is so often used in European or North American debates. We have to reach the consumer and help the consumer to make. I am so fed up with being reduced to a consumer. Of course, part of what I do is consume, and I wish I could make better choices because they would be more available and more easily accessible. But I'm a citizen. I expect that those who I elect, I expect that those in important societal positions, that they take responsibility. And that is what I expect as a citizen. And that's how I think we should have the debate. Don't reduce me to being a consumer. So I'm very glad you raised that point. The other thing is, yes, communicate to the people, But I think as scientists, we should be able to produce more knowledge with people. And we've done really nice projects where we did build knowledge on health and air pollution with citizens in local communities with new technology, calibrated, new, cheap technology. We involved the local laboratories in a local university. We involved the local municipality on that. So by creating an understanding, not by communicating to people, but creating with them a knowledge base, I think they feel more connected to the problem, and also you change the debate, you shift the debate. So I'm sure that was also somewhere in your mind, but that's a really important trajectory that we are working on as well. And technology there is extremely helpful. There are really cheap monitoring devices that work very well, that allow us to work in a very different way than with the expensive calibrated setups that often are way too expensive to work at the local level. So I just wanted to mention those two things.
Does anybody want to react on Hans' additional input? Yeah. Otherwise, I would like to follow up with additional question, which fits quite well to what has been just said. In the past, in terms of environment, there was always these goals of stop environmental loss, stop the rate of environmental degradation. And when you look in the documents which you, Hans, you, Elisabeth, and Jan mentioned, the EU biodiversity strategy, for example, or the circular economy action plan, or the not the latest perhaps, but the drafts before of the 2030 post biodiversity framework, there is different language in there, namely give nature, give planet, give the world back more than we take. And that's a total shift. And I wonder if this is such a systemic change which we need. In each action which we do, we have to think how we give back more than we really take during this action. And that is really in all those 3 documents which I mentioned, more or less in the same way formulated, and are in, for example, environmental impact assessment. It was always yet minimize the effects, yeah? But you had then those cumulative effects which increase just the overall environmental effect again, yeah? But if you have to think in the front, how do I give back more than I take, yeah? Does this change the game somehow, or is this perhaps a dangerous trap beam, yeah? I'm not sure, so I would like to know your opinion on this. Thank you.
If I may begin, that statement you are referring to really makes sense, because we have reached what Ian had mentioned, Ian or Hans, the tipping points. We have done so much damage that unless there's a systemic change across the board, then we'll still be going back. So that damage, which has reached unprecedented rates, need to a 360 degrees shift completely to make a difference, and not the on the surface changes, which Hans was referring, is looking at the surface and not deep dive into the roots of the problems. We need to look at the roots of what happened that the world has reached where we are. Virtually every report gives us sad news, and to really shift completely. And that's why repeatedly business as usual is no longer an option. We need a complete shift, a complete systemic shift, not to think of going back, but really change completely to be able to see those differences taking place, and not to go back where we have reached. And I don't think we have an option of going back, because as I said, we either make it or perish. So if we want to perish, then we'll do the top of the table soil changes here and there. But if we don't want to perish, then we need a systemic shift. on everything we do. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want me to add on top of that, I think also, unfortunately or fortunately for us, the COVID pandemic actually, I think, shook us a little bit in reassessing how we connect with nature and what it means to us. I mean, everybody was in quarantine inside their house for a long time and didn't get to reconnect with nature. There was a news story I had read recently about the amount of national parks actually that were getting an overwhelming number of visitors right after quarantine restrictions had lifted in Canada and parts of the United States. I mean, I think there's a new appreciation for nature that coincided with the pandemic. And I don't know if that would trigger this transformative change that you're talking about, Volker, about giving back more or thinking about how we consume, even though we're not just consumers, as Hans said. But yeah, so that's my addition on top of Elizabeth's.
Yeah, Volker, just to add on what Elizabeth and Hien have been talking about, I think if we want to take biodiversity seriously in these new ambitions, and it's pretty much restoration, I think, and this link with nature-based solutions and well-being, it's clear that we need to address indeed these deep drivers, and we know what they are. They are landscape fragmentation. It's about land use and practices in the agricultural system and in some other practices like the forest sector. It's about pollution and increasingly also the link with climate change. So again, it's climate change, but that's another field in terms of policy often. But the other elements are absolutely essential. And you are not going to do this by protecting, in the European context, from 20% of the territory to 30% of the territory. You don't save biodiversity even on 30% of the territory. You save biodiversity and strengthen ecosystem services on 100% of the territory. So understanding that and then having policies that actually address these issues in the core drivers, that's what it's all about. And of course, that is difficult. Yeah, it would be bizarre if it would not be difficult, because it's so deeply embedded in how we have been neglecting nature. We even have a strange economic term for it. We call it an externality. Now, I know what an externality is in economic terms, but the term in and of itself, if you go a little bit to discourse analysis in this, it sort of suggests that it's outside of us. It is not. We are deeply connected to it in eco-social systems. So that's where I think we have our core issues.
Thank you so much.
Much. We have a long list of questions from the audience to you. I think we can start with a question to all of you. Will we be successful in the transformative change if we only focus on human well-being? An anthropocentric starting point may not provide a trajectory towards global sustainability within planetary boundaries if we do not consider also nature's intrinsic values. That's a really good question and a complex one. So does anyone of you want to start on that one?
I can give it a try while others are thinking. Where we are now, and Hen had reminded us that our relationship, human action relationship with nature, need to change drastically. The nature loss, the ongoing nature loss, climate change, all these have been, and science again has proven that human action on them, on the environment, has been responsible for the loss, for the changes we see. So unless our relationship with nature changes, then it means business as usual continues. And if pandemic situation we are in now cannot be a lesson for us not to go back, then it means we are ready for even serious pandemics in future than what we have seen already. And I don't think any of us wants to go back to the lockdowns which we have suffered for over a year, and just trying to emerge with all the uncertainties which go with it. So I think the message has been clear to us human beings, human well-being, that we can only exercise the right to human well-being, clean environment, if our relationship with nature changes. We need to really ensure that the nature we are sitting, the nature we depend on, the nature which is also affected by our own actions, is no longer affected as we have done in the past years. How do we do that? This is where I said each and every one of us has a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I would pick another one of the questions, and it's about policymakers and how to more effectively persuade them. What would be approaches to more effectively persuade policymakers? Yeah, it's related actually to the former one. Shall we only argue from the anthropocentric perspective? What could be more ecocentric approaches perhaps also? So it's tricky perhaps, but I'm sure you have some proposals regarding this, how to address them more effectively.
Well, first of all, I think you need to understand better, I think, as a knowledge or science player, what and how and where and when to have impact. I mean, and the higher you go, the more you need to be considerate about that. Which is why in the agency also I'm talking about a more radical shift away from a production place where we produce knowledge and papers and indicators to an impact place. What do we need to produce to have impact? It's a bit of a different logic. And I think clarity of what you are saying in a language and in a context that is political, but that is also socio-economic, is absolutely critical. And that is not easy to do, because we work in highly fragmented and segmented fields of science. So that's again where these connections come in. I think you also need to do it in a way that is very clear and therefore in its own right very political, but that is engaging and not to put it bluntly, okay, let's get rid of capitalism and voila, this is our call, and if you want to, I'll raise a fist to go along with that. That is not exactly what policymakers are listening to. You can send the same messages in a very different way that engages them in a fundamental debate that is fact-based. So I think our main responsibility is to create a space that is fact and knowledge-based, that doesn't avoid talking about the difficult stuff, and that engages them to connect to those who can bring knowledge to the table. And then you have to be humble, because it's not only knowledge, of course, that drives policymakers, it's all sorts of other issues as well. So I think I'm in an audience now that is investing its productive life in knowledge. So we have a responsibility to do what we do as good as we can. And for the rest, we need to count on others who have made other choices in life and have their role to play. Voilà, that's my humble contribution to this sort of debate.
Thank you very much. Does anyone of you want to add something to that, or should we move to the next question?
I can add a few words. When we talk of policymakers, many times we refer to members of parliament, ministers at that level and the like, the decision makers in a society, in a country. We need to remember that these are short-term lived personalities in any national setting. And the moment that these personalities come on board, many times is also looking at short-term measures because they need to make an impact and move on when they are not sure whether they will be elected the next upcoming elections. So again, this is where communication matters because these people are looking for votes moving forward for the future. We need again to change our language when we converse with them so that they can use that as part of their campaign slogans to be able to return back to either to the House, to the cabinet, or as the case may be. So again, strategy, targeting specific stakeholders when we communicate, and policymakers are key to this so that then they can achieve the results during that short period there in the system becomes key. And how then they can use our issues as the campaign slogans for their own constituencies to be able to get that support. And this is where then I was saying earlier on, really, for the parliamentarians to speak to their constituents, it means that constituents has to relate to those messages into their own setting. If I don't know this, this is how I will suffer. Yes, I need this leader because he has brought the issues at my doorstep in terms of taking action and really use that. So we need to also bear in mind when we talk of policymakers, how long. We don't have policymakers for 10 years. It's 4, 5 years. And we need to have them make that difference and impact within that short period. So what strategies can we use to get them on board and really join us in our campaigns? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have another question that's posed to Jan and also to Elizabeth about the readiness of countries to agree on 30% protected areas by 2030. Do you have any prospects or enabling conditions for this agreement?
May I add, because I want to include Hans also in this question, because in the European Union we are almost at the 30% actually, but most or many of those 30% are paper parks and they are not well managed. So the effectiveness of the management of the areas is also at stake in this question. So Hans, you please also feel free to add to this question.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Masanori. And if I can just jump in here, I'll just focus on the first part because the enabling conditions and the readiness of countries, maybe the others would be more likely to comment on. But from the global assessment, the target, the assessment of the progress on targets and the achievement, one of the ones that was the most closest or we achieved was the one on protected areas, which was previously 17% for terrestrial areas and 10% for marine areas. My impression in attending all of these CBD meetings and in discussion with stakeholders is that they are ready, since that was a readily achieved target, to increase ambition to 30% on protected areas by 2030 as a minimum. So the science is also there. There was a bunch of papers that have come out that have looked at economic analysis, financial analysis, extinction risk analysis on the benefits for biodiversity and ecosystem services for a minimum protection of 30% by 2030. So in my opinion, I think that countries are ready. They're ready to be bold, especially on this target. And also from what Volker had said, you know, all of the indicators for this target, this new target would suggest also looking at effectiveness of the protected areas for managing and protecting biodiversity, and also management of the protected areas would also be an important aspect. So not just protecting an area that is already not being used or not traveled on or of low biodiversity value. So there are other area-based kind of areas that, there are other areas that are have higher biodiversity values, such as key biodiversity areas, that could be considered as well. So on to Elizabeth and Hans to complement on that answer.
Thank you. I think here you put it right. We should all recall that when we did the Global Biodiversity Outlook, looking at the status of the 20 Aichi targets, when we launched the report September last year, basically the conclusion was none of the 20 Aichi targets were met. But now we can say the only one, except about 6, which we had made some progress. But since then, between December to now, at least one target which has been reached is the protected area 17% of the terrestrial. And we are about to reach the 10% marine areas. So in terms of the baseline, on expanding it further to the proposed 30%, one can say it's possible to reach that. But I think the important question there is the effectiveness, because expanding an area is easy, but ensuring effective management of these areas, conservation measures taking place in these areas is another subject. 1. 2, while we see a number of governments supporting an increase to 30 by 30 of the protected areas, so condition number 1 is effectiveness of their management. Condition number 2 is the recognition of the rights of the indigenous peoples and local communities, the land owners of many of these areas and the resource owners of a number of these areas, and to learn from them how they have been successfully traditional to manage these areas. So the issue of rights-based approaches to the expansion of the areas becomes key. And currently, while many countries are supporting the increase, there's also pressure from these other stakeholders, particularly indigenous people and local communities, that appropriate safeguards need to be put in place to ensure that their areas are well protected, and the decisions include them, need to have that inclusive, transparent engagement and their participation in such decisions. So rights-based approach, the rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, their traditional knowledge, all these safeguards hopefully will be considered by the negotiators as they talk of looking at whether to expand the protected areas or not, and the effective management of those areas if finally agreed. Thank you.
Yeah, what can I add after all that has been said? Also in Europe, of course, it's the actual management practices are still lagging behind. So it's about ecosystem-based management and really following up on that and having a system that works there. Yes, we might be reaching 17% now and then 10% in the marine environment, but if you look at the assessments that are made and you look at the word existential threat, I mean, you have to think, how far have we come as the so-called intelligent species that it takes us so long to then almost have to celebrate as a victory that we're at 17 and 10%. Guys, we've got a job to do, and this is not good enough. That needs to be, I think, the clear message. I think there are several things that are missing. One is investments in these good management practices. That requires investments. Secondly, fighting illegal practices. I've done quite a bit of research as a researcher and a professor when I was in that job. There is so much illegal practices there. Thirdly, ownership, Elizabeth, I think indeed is absolutely critical. We also know from people like Eleanor Ostrom how important ownership is in these management practices. And I think the issue of indigenous people, I couldn't agree more. And that's where illegal things are crossed with human rights, I think in a very fundamental way. And if you go back to Agenda 21 and the Rio Declaration, it's written there 30 years ago. And I recently reread the documents coming out of Stockholm. I invite everybody to go back to them. It's disheartening how little we have put into practice in many ways in the last 50 years. So those things were mentioned there. And then a last thing, of course, is that we should make better use of monitoring, reporting, and verification on biodiversity. The system that exists in that domain is lagging far behind the climate change system of monitoring, reporting, and verification, and is clearly not living up to the standards when it comes to connecting the two. So because, you know, all of these assessments on the biodiversity side, they all look different. Whereas on climate, at least we have now a couple of decades of sort of consistent reporting based on a sort of system that allows us to track progress in a more uniform way. So I would plead very strongly in the CBD to a stronger MRV framework, and one that can be supported by new technology like satellite observation for restoration and issues of that nature.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure, we have 4 minutes left for the discussion, if we should start another round, or give you also a last word of the thing you consider most important, most pressing to immediately do. So that might be perhaps already something like a wrapping up from all of your sides. If you could give us a last statement of the most important, most pressing aspect you would address towards a systemic change. What would it be?
I will. Maybe I'll just start off, and then we'll end with Elizabeth and Hans. But the immediate, in my opinion, the immediate thing to do is really this year is to have political will to come to an agreement on this really critical post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So I've watched and followed the negotiation over the years and the consultations, and there are a lot of sticking points. But we need to, there needs to be political will to come to an agreement, one that's ambitious and bold and measurable, which Hans was talking about monitoring. I mean, it's a sticky situation during negotiations, but I'm hoping that immediately, within the next few months in October, that we will have good faith agreements and political will towards a common, ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So that's kind of my wish for the next steps of this year.
I fully agree. For me, from in the Biodiversity Secretariat, our main goal this year is to have the post-2020 global biodiversity framework adopted. But adoption is one. It's really the political will I hope Ian is referring to is not just adoption, but to have a framework and the will to implement it. Because it's very easy to have a nice document decorating our shelves and something else completely to move it from the shelf to the ground for action. And for it to be implemented, of course, we know many countries will need to be supported. So my other wish is really to have ensure there are adequate resources for its implementation. We are looking at hopefully redirecting unsustainable biodiversity incentives from 100 billion spent per year so that those can be directed into greener nature outcomes. We are looking at over $10 billion per year to support those countries in need for implementation. We are looking at those countries in need to be supported in terms of capacity building, technology transfer. And of course, to be able to measure the impact and progress being made with the implementation of the framework. So accountability framework, transparency framework, monitoring frameworks, because otherwise it will be meaningless to have the goals, the targets, and now we have the indicators already posted if then there are no means to measure progress, and be able to adjust as we go along, and really then be able to effectively contribute also to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, because the framework has targets to 2030, aligning very well with the SDGs, and in the long term to 2050, meeting our vision of living in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Yeah, I can very much agree with that, but in the end, it's all about understanding what it means to live well within the limits of the planet with about 10 billion people. And I think it's clear that the current model of production and consumption is absolutely not compatible with that goal. That is clear, but equally important for me is that the current distribution of wealth on this planet is not compatible with that. As long as Oxfam can write its 1% report, or I mean, you cannot say that the current inequality on this planet is a fertile ground for sustainability. So for me, that is an absolutely essential component of the discussion. And in that sense, I'm totally with Elizabeth on the money that is needed for implementation of the CBD. At the same time, we're dealing with a global economy that is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars or euros or yen or whatever you want to take. And so the 100 billion is flying around in the global economy on a daily basis. So it is about transforming the economy. And we're currently overvaluing financial capital, undervaluing social capital, and hardly valuing natural capital. And that needs to be turned around. Natural capital is the foundation on which we will need to build healthy societies, for which we need an enabling economy, not an economy that can draw on the other capital for a sort of unequal outcome that we have today. And I think if we can move in that direction, and I know these are lofty words, but these are the words that are embedded in all the preambles of all these UN conventions. If you read them, you need a handkerchief. They bring tears to your eyes. Yeah, well, they have a meaning, and the meaning needs to be translated in policies that are true to what we have been discussing now for more than half a century at the global level. So that would be my final statement. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your time and for the very interesting discussion. And in the end, you also highlighted how interwoven these three aspects of sustainable development are: the financial and the environmental and the social perspective. So now, Volker, you want to thank the speakers?
Thank you. And we forgot today in the morning actually to thank also with our little gift to Jeffrey Sachs. And actually what we do is we plan to plant trees for each of you with a UN affiliated organization. So this organization is affiliated with the UN Restoration Decade. And we will plant trees, 10 trees for each of you, and we will send you the certificate. So that's our little contribution. And I hope you like our gift, and it's perhaps a different gift than otherwise is given, but I think it's a meaningful gift. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for all the questions in the chat. Sorry if we have not covered full them. And but thank you for contributing in each way, and particularly the speakers. Thank you really for your valuable time and for your great insights into the topic. So with having said this,
yes, now we are having a short break for half an hour. We are restarting the parallel sessions at 4 p.m. So then you have to check out the program and choose your favorite topics, or if you are going to present something, you need to go and visit your session and check that your slides are okay and so on. And we'll meet you here in the studio tomorrow morning again. Yes. And tonight, after the parallel session, we also have the membership meeting, right?
There's the first membership meeting of ISDRS taking place after the next parallel sessions, and everybody, not only the members, are welcome to this session, and to join us on the discussions. And I want also to invite these plenary speakers to stay in the afternoon with us if they have the opportunity. I know, Hien, it's 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning. I know what you may be doing after this session. So, but if you have the opportunity to join our 1 hour first session, you are registered, and you can join today, tomorrow, or day after tomorrow, whenever you like, and if you have time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.
Have a good break, and
Yeah.
have a good day wherever and whichever time it is with you. Thank you. See you in...
Jag bor i Härnösand.
Jag bor i Höga Kusten.
Det här är mitt Härnösand.
Dagarna dundrar, lovar och ljuger, gråter och blinkar, blinkar och stannar, en tanke på slutet utav glädje.
Jag bor i Härnösand.
Det här är mitt Härnösand.
Jag bor i Härnösand.
Det här är vårt Härnösand. Mitt Härnösand.
Jag bor i Härnösand.
Det här är mitt Härnösand.
Jag bor i Höga Kusten.
Det här är vårt Härnösand.